every time it's reviewed, there's a blogger who works for the guy Donahue who always follows it up. And actually, we had the U.S. premiere very recently in Milwaukee. That was a very emotionally charged premiere. And the church released a statement saying, we feel it's very sad that this film should be shown. You know, this is an old story, and showing this story now is like, what did they say? It was like removing the scab from an old wound that only hurts the victims. So it won't surprise you to learn that the survivors who turned out in force in Milwaukee had a very different view. So we'll see what happens as the film goes along. But that seems to be a rather consistent mechanism by the church, which is to say, this is old stuff, we know all about this, let's move on.
You mentioned in the film that the Vatican chose not to comment, but did you feel at any point in time as you were gathering momentum in making the documentary that there was any obstruction?
No, I didn't. But honestly, we didn't publicize the film very much at all. In fact, I tried to keep a very low profile. I was actually hoping, you know, I purposefully loosely structured the film in the hopes that I might at some point get the Vatican to talk. And indeed, there's a rather articulate guy in the Vatican, this guy who's referred to obliquely as Ratzinger's prosecutor, a man named Scicluna, who is a fascinating and very interesting character, and did do a pretty good job of collecting witnesses before the case was summarily dismissed. So I had hopes that he would talk, but he didn't. Yeah, I think we just made a deal with a very adventurous Italian distributor who has an excellent plan, figuring that, you know, RAI and some of the other networks won't naturally embrace it. They're going to have a kind of 30-city simultaneous theatrical distribution and then distribute it on DVD throughout the country. They're a very aggressive and provocative distributor, and I'm confident that we can make a big noise there. Well, it was said that it was banned. I mean, I don't know if the Venice Film Festival would say banned. They didn't accept it, but I do know that the Venice Film Festival, let's say, was under political pressure not to accept the film. I mean, the overall greater plan for the film is to distribute it as widely as possible, and also to, via websites and all the broadcasters in all the various countries around the world. It's going to have a rather robust theatrical distribution in Ireland, for example, to connect people with all of the groups who are trying to do something about this, either on a basic civil level, and also terribly important to distribute this film, I think, in Africa and South America, where I think, you know, the Catholic Church is not unlike the cigarette companies in the sense that now there's a lot of resistance to this in Europe and the United States and Ireland, but there's a lot less, there's a lot more potential for abuse, let's put it, in South America and Africa at the moment, and so we're hoping to get it widely distributed there.
Have you had interaction once you completed the film with deaf organizations, both in America and perhaps around the world, and their response to it, and how they feel it perhaps would benefit their organizations in some way?
Yeah, I mean, look, this was a world that I knew, I'm ashamed to say, very little about, and I went into it very much a neophyte and tried to represent it as best I could, and it was a tricky thing for me, and we've gotten a lot of support so far from deaf organizations. We're working very hard to come up, at least in a theatrical context, with either very technically sophisticated ways of having captions that people can see without the hearing folks being disturbed, or having a caption system that actually takes place underneath the screen and things like that to be sensitive. But also, I was very concerned along the way with how the presentation would work, because I really wanted the cinematic presentation to work both for hearing audiences and for the deaf. And it was a very complicated process in terms of how we ultimately ended up filming those interviews in a way that tried to do that initially very much resisted by the deaf, who said, no, you must only shoot in one very wide frame so that all the gestures can be seen. And indeed, during the interview, one of the interviewees rightly said, well, why are you putting a microphone, over me? Why are you getting so worked up about this? I'm deaf, I can't speak. But the reason was to show that struggle of the deaf to be heard. And there's something about that's the sounds that we hear, which is a kind of represents that frustration. And also we ended up, if this is interesting to anybody, shooting those interviews with 4 cameras, and also I had to be in a separate room in order to be able to capture that sound, and we had a simultaneous translation of interpreters going on at the same time. The fact is that until very recently, principally 2002 in Boston, the police almost always looked the other way. And it often had to do with, in heavily Catholic cities where the church was at its most powerful, there were also, not surprisingly, heavily Catholic police forces. And indeed here, it was there were many excruciating examples that I could have included, but in one example here, at one time, the kids went to the police and said, there's abuse going on at the school. The police promptly went back to Murphy and said, well, what about this abuse? The kids say there's abuse going on. He said, oh, don't listen to them, they're retarded. Retarded was the word he used. So, and the police said, oh, okay, I guess, investigation closed. So, in fact, it's a rather appalling record, as it was with as it was in Ireland. It is interesting the way that raising one's voice can change things, and it has slowly done, so that now in Philadelphia there was a very aggressive prosecution of priests and indeed monsignors and bishops over the cover-up, and also in St. Louis recently. So it has started to change, but mostly because people rose up and said, what the hell is going on here? My children need to be protected.
Does it worry you that there's a general tide that's turning, that unfortunately some priests who were silenced and perhaps were not so much in the wrong as others are going to be caught up in this?
Yeah, no, I think that is a concern. It's a concern that the church raises, and it's a concern that the church raises about opening the archives. There's a really pretty easy way to solve that problem, which is to work with human rights groups or other legal organizations to make sure that names are properly redacted, so that you can, and hand it over to civil authorities for proper investigation, so that innocent people aren't improperly accused. There are ways to do it. But yeah, and frankly, there always has to be a concern for that. You have to be careful that just because somebody says there was abuse, you need more than that, of course.